All right. Hi, everybody. I think most of you know each other. There's a few new people here. I know Tyler. Uh, how you doing, Tyler? I just met Florian. Eitan. Eitan. Okay. I don't think I met Eitan. I met Eitan and John in the last session. Um, just want to say thanks to Tony to put this together. And like I was explaining, when Tony said, asked me if I would host some or host or moderate a discussion, I started to think, well, let me before I give him an answer, let's see if I can come up with something remotely interesting to talk about. And this came to my mind, which is when you make a bow, basically, you want your bow to go to a nice musician, but that musician is going to move away. Everybody understands that the perfect situation is like that baby never leaves home, and you always see it back for rehair, or you need to restore it, you restore it. I have done bow restorations on things that were completely butchered, and it's actually sad to see from people that I admire as makers, and I almost cried when I saw the bow. I was like, oh my God, I know the person that made it, and he would be so upset because I put myself in those shoes. I said I would be so upset if I saw my bow treated like that by a technician. It wasn't the player. It's like it falls into the hands of people that are either beginning and taking too many chances on things that they shouldn't be working on, but they took a chance and basically damaged the bow. So basically, my idea is like, what can bow makers think about and do, and is there a limit to aesthetics? When you're making, for example, your frog, and you really like to see the ferrule really not so tall, as skinny as you can, it's beautiful. But what are you compromising? So what are the limits? There is definitely a balance of aesthetics and functionality and structural integrity on the bow. And I think for a maker pushing the envelope, he may see that in the future it's a bow. For example, there are some bows that I see from younger makers that really are paying a lot of attention to aesthetics and new design. That I look at it and it comes to me for rehair, and I'm thinking, boy, this guy that made this bow, he's lucky that that bow is in my bench, not next door. I know some other people around here. It's like, so that's very lucky. And I said, this bow probably will not last, a couple more years in the condition it is. The tip will be broken, the tongue is going to be gone. Mortises are too small. So in that sense, I have put together a small list, but I like people to, maybe I'll talk about something, and then somebody can pitch in their own experience on that. So the first one that I wrote down is what I call the wings on the stick. Let's see if I can get I don't know if anybody can see this, but this is what I call the wings on the frog. So when those are not cut, these are cut back. This is like way too short for my taste. But when these are not cut far back enough, they're sticking out all the way here. It causes a problem in the future when somebody's shoving a wedge there, and some people hammer it, and you end up developing a crack right along the side. So brand new bow, first rehair, there's a crack. Does anybody has seen those come through your shop? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is one major issue, and you're not going to fix, the majority of people doing bow work out there. So and so this is for the younger makers. I'm sure most makers pay attention to that, but do not make these wings here too close to the edge here. Halfway, it's plenty. These are too short, in my opinion. Too short, you're weakening also the tongue here. There's not enough strength here on the bottom.
Can you add to that, Vito, the tendency for new makers to make the thickness for the spread wedge very, very thin?
Yes, that's the other thing I wanted to do. So you can do both ways. You can go too thin, or you can go, make that thickness too thick. Too thin, basically, let's see, I have one here that's really, really thick. So, okay, this to me, it's a little bit, it's too much, you know. So what happens here, you have a very, this already has been destroyed apparently, but you have a very thin tongue and super fragile. But if you make that too thin, then what happens is that you're going to end up, somebody's going to end up making a wedge and either shove it there too hard, and you end up with this ferrule flat part basically being pushed up, creating a big curve. Then you're going to get one of those tools from Saigao to push it back down, which is it's a great tool. I have to recommend a tool for that. Is anything else on that, Josh, that you can think of?
Here's a question or a concern is regarding the ferrule and the wings. I mean, what is, I've heard the recommended is maybe like half the distance as far as length. Here's the other thing is about hardening your ferrule. There's some makers when they make their ferrule, they anneal it to work it, and it may not even be hard enough to really handle a wedge. It'll deform very easily, not by me, but by somebody else. So as a maker, I make sure that my ferrules are pretty hard.
Yes. Do you anneal them? Do you do like a heat treat?
No, I just after I solder it, I let it air cool.
Okay. I do hammer my flats.
Mm.
Yeah. So I do have like a half a mandrel, and I hammer it. So this is, to me, is a really good way to harden. You don't need to worry about the hardening of the curved part at all, but the flat part, I use a hammer and a hammer to create basically a tension on the surface. It's basically surface hardened.
Mm.
The other way to do that is with a little kiln like this.
Yeah.
To heat harden it. It's actually called age hardening, but doing larger ferrules, like base ferrules, for instance. I don't have a mandrel yet. Another one of those things I need to make, but I find it much easier. And this is not just work hardens the surface, but the whole thing. And there's information out there about that out on the interweb. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying about the rails and the thickness. I find newly made bows to be some of the most difficult to rehair because of that. The rails come all the way out. And I had a bow a few years ago made by Mitsu Sasano, who learned from Stefan Thomas show, I think. But the rails came all the way out to where they joined the ferrule, the front of the ferrule.
Yes.
And I rehaired it a few times, and the guy had it rehaired it somewhere else. And then the next time I saw it, those rails had been chopped off.
Yes.
And so that's the danger, is someone else, again, who know, I don't know who did that, but yeah, it's very difficult to rehair it. And so the tendency of someone less trained or less capable to go, oh, here's a problem, they just cut it away.
Yeah, and I think the discussion that we're having here is basically because of the experience that you had, Josh, and I do a lot of restoration.
Me
A lot
too.
of makers, by choice, they refuse to do restoration. They just do making. So they see a lot less of the results of some of their choices, out in the hands of even skilled people. Have a sometimes a hard time. If you have those wings almost to the front, the precision. I have to up my attention like a few notches. And I do this plenty rehairs, and I don't think anyone here does more rehairs than Josh. So, and I know that if he sees a bow like that, his attention goes up a little, and he says, "This is something I have to now pay a little extra attention. Otherwise, I'll create some problem here too." And that shouldn't be happening. That this is a part of the design of the bow that is unnecessary. It doesn't add anything, as far as aesthetics. For example, that one specifically. Some other things do. If you're talking about the shape of the head, and but another one that I'd like to mention is the channel for the hair. Aside from this, the space here for the hair and the wedge, which is important. If you have too much, you basically are compromising the strength of the tongue. But if it is too little, then the person doing the rehair has to cut this paper thin wedge, just barely to hold everything, and it falls apart as you push it in. So it's another set of nightmares. So I think a millimeter and a half space is a good starting point. Between 1.5, 1.7, I think is a good space there, and for balance. But also the channel, this channel for the hair inside, of the frog. That's another thing that some people don't leave enough space, and that's sometimes it has to do with the design of the frog. If they made this too flat, they don't have enough space for the hair to actually travel, and for you to actually put that pearl slide back in. I've seen pearl slides where people have carved the bottom of the pearl slide to be, and some of them are original. I've seen a bow from Francois Malot that he made in, I think it was when he made it in Paris, and one from Pierre Fuchs. That's the same thing. He actually carved, very nicely carved though, the inside of the ebony slide, just to, accommodate all the hair. But this is something that um, you have to make accommodations for when you're making a bow. This can be too narrow or too shallow. So I always do it with about a half a millimeter close to the dovetail rails when I make my bows. It's about a half a millimeter out. So I like to create more space here. If you do that, you're not compromising strength, really. You can keep the height of the tongue here decent enough if you have enough width, especially toward the front. You can open it up a little bit more as you come toward the front to, allow the hair to actually spread. And because everyone knows these are delicate areas, you get a technician out there that, he will put too much hair on your violin bow, invariably. So you have to, it would be a good idea to make accommodations for more hair than necessary, when you carve these, these frogs, because it will happen. And in the process of putting the pearl back, he is going to really press it. And if there's not enough space, your frog is going to break in the hands of, a rehair technician out there.
Vito, it looks like some people had some questions or some things to share. Is that all right if they share?
Yeah, absolutely.
John, you wanted to share something, and did Florian? Did you want to share something too? You're muted, so you have to unmute.
No, I don't have a question. Thank you.
Okay. So, John.
Well, being one of those guys who make more bows than rehairs, I would like to ask Vito for the ebony part that goes out in the ferrule. What would you say would be the minimum thickness of that for it to be strong enough to last in time? Because the fashion with my colleagues, and I tend to do that as well, is to make very small ferrules because it looks very nice. But what would you, how much ebony would you think would be the minimum for the bow to be long-lasting?
What do you think when you're saying the ebony part? Which part? You're talking about the height here?
Yes, this part.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the idea is that this part will depend a lot on the space of hair. I know that some fine makers make that space very small so they can, make this very thin and at the same time maintain the integrity of strength of the tongue. And that's the compromise you have where, bow makers will have to come up with a very thin spread wedge. I think that's a better solution, to put pressure on the bow rehair to put a thin spread wedge. But if you're doing that, you have to think about that, they may put an oversized or a thicker spread wedge than the necessary. It will create that bend on the flat part eventually. And if people don't know how to put it back, it creates a big set of problems on how the hair is distributed, on the ribbon. If you have a band, it's much more challenging to get a very nice even ribbon. And if people like a little bit more hair on the edges, forget about it, because you have this hole in the center, basically,
Yeah, well, personally, I try to have at least the 2 millimeters of ebony at the end.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you can see this is about 1, slightly over 1. So this is too much. 2 millimeters, I think, is a good compromise. 2 millimeters, I think, is strong enough. Especially if you, if you make the channel here a little wider and not so deep, so you're not compromising the strength here, the height.
Yeah.
So Vito, though, the spread wedge, that's left up to a technician to rehair correctly. Even if the gap was sufficient enough, let's say 1.5 millimeters to 1.7 millimeters for the hair and the wedge, it still isn't going to prevent somebody from still fitting too tight of a wedge. I mean, there are people that still fit too tight of a wedge. From the making standpoint, it would just make sense to leave sufficient room, but still leave enough room for it to be strong enough, and just that as far as the making goes.
Yes, I agree, and I think what it may be because of habit, because I like probably Josh, I prefer when there's enough space that you can cut a spread wedge that has some kind of rigidity than when it's super thin and it's like a wafer, it's like it's flexible, the wedge itself is flexible. It's a little more challenging. And I think if it's like that in the hands of somebody that doesn't do enough of this work and doesn't understand the physics of that area, haven't seen too many bent frogs, it's going to create more problems. It doesn't solve it, but I think it just exacerbates a little bit on the hands of people that are not skilled. So,
If I may add, there's a maker, he's in Spain, although he's an English maker named Michael Taylor. Are y'all familiar with Michael Taylor's bows? I mean, he's a really good copyist, and the bows are well made. And because there's a collector here in Atlanta that is really close with him and actually imports him from Spain to rehair his collection of bows, which is quite impressive. I spoke with Michael Taylor, and if y'all have ever rehaired his bows, he leaves little to no room for a spread wedge. And it's because he hairs his bows with the hair reversed so that the thin end of the hair goes into the frog and the thick end goes into the head.
mm-hmm.
He insists that this is the way the Hills haired all their bows. But in a discussion with Peter, his response was absolutely not. So, but if y'all ever run into a Michael Taylor bow, you're going to have to get out maybe even the cigarette paper or cut a super thin spread wedge.
Yes. And but that's the case with a lot of really fine makers. I've seen some bows come with a super thin space for you to accommodate both the hair and the wedge. So I think it's in the hands of people that have done lots of bow restoration and rehairs, it's a little bit more attention than you pay, but it's not an unsurmountable challenge. It's an easy challenge to meet, I think. The other thing that and I picked the brain of Chuck Aspie just a couple of days ago. I said, hey, I'm gonna have and he's one of the ones that leave very small space. He said, Vito, I leave very little space for the hair and the wedge. I said, whatever, I said, if it comes to me, you're lucky. But he also mentioned to me, like mortise, the mortise size on the frog is an important thing because, when you're putting that plug in, if the space, the length of the mortise is not sufficient, the plug actually will for a lot of people would just dive in instead of like sit itself in, so when you have the plug keep diving in, it's super frustrating. Everybody knows that, right? So Charles was telling me, people would recut your mortise if you make a mortise that's too small. So instead of having a technician out there getting a chisel and going at it on your mortise, cut your mortise a little bit longer, let me see if I can get a reference, because a lot of what I do is just by feel and so I don't measure a lot of things. It's only by eye or feel. So I'm measuring here a mortise, like I don't know if you guys can see the size of this one here. So that to me looks like an appropriate mortise length. And that's about 0.85 millimeters. So, or I'm sorry, 8.5 millimeters. So
here's a question. Let's say you get a frog in, it doesn't look good. Sometimes on like a machine-made frog, mass-produced bow, I mean, I might go ahead and modify it so it's right. So because I'd rather do it than have the person down the street do it that'll end up doing a poor job. Obviously, with historical makers, you just don't touch nothing. Just like if you got a Tubbs that's supposed to be wedgeless, you don't do anything. But
I think
where's the line with handmade bows by modern makers? Where it's nearly impossible to rehair. I haven't seen one, but what do you do at that point?
I think that that touches on a very interesting topic, maybe also for a full discussion, which is the ethics of restoring bows. And the whole approach to restoring that I use is use the least amount of intervention and try to remove the least amount of original material. But in the end, you have to come up with a result that you are comfortable will last for 100 years. That's always my approach to things. If I think that something I'm doing, it's on that line that, okay, I'll repair this. I'm saving all the wood almost, but in a year I'll see this back here with another break. It makes no sense to me. So on that sense, I have a lot of bows that just the other day I have a couple of bows that came in with round holes with a round plug in the front. So of course you recut those, but then you have the ones that are not round, but they don't have the correct geometry. They don't have enough angle in the front end, the back end, maybe it's got too much angle that, you're gonna get that plug coming out all the time. So I recut it. Again, the ethics part is was this bow made by a modern maker? Was this bow fully handmade by someone? Is this a factory frog? I do that on the frogs from the, I don't know if everyone knows here, but I am one of the owners of Arcos Brazil, and we have a group of makers in Brazil making bows. And I rehair some of my own bows, which gives me a good opportunity to give them feedback. You guys, they get the frogs from Paula's and some other companies, and these frogs are made really well made, but the geometry of the mortise on the frog is not optimal, for professional bows. So I normally recut it, and I ask them to do that in Brazil too. So I think it's a good idea to recut something that will give less problems if it is a factory and you can clearly see that, there are issues with the geometry and size, etc.
Yeah.
Josh?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there, but yeah, I've always felt that any of the factory bows, the Brazilian workshop bows, Chinese bows, old German factory bows, if they come across my bench and the mortises are wrong, they get recut.
Yeah.
And bringing it to the context of us as modern makers, yes, many modern makers make things stylistically different that make it more difficult to rehair, but in general, the mortise shapes and geometries are correct. You might have to do a thinner spread wedge or deal with long rails or something, but I think stylistically things on modern bows are I very, very infrequently ever find a modern bow or a properly made bow that I open up for a rehair and it's like, things are correct in general.
Yeah. Yes. I think on modern bows, the main issue is not the geometry so much, but the length of the mortise. You see sometimes a little too short.
Yeah, stylistic things like that. Yeah.
My biggest complaint with modern bow makers, and I've gotten taken to task online for this opinion, but I don't care, is the use of curved head mortises. I think they're unnecessarily dangerous since that bow is going to find its way into a shop that doesn't do anything but cut straight plugs. And of course, I don't modify them. I actually enjoy cutting those plugs. I find it fun. But I think that modern makers that use the curved head mortises are taking an unnecessary risk.
Yeah, I think what Chris is saying that is these surfaces here when they curve in. So basically, you got to cut your plug, to curve out the same way. This basically does not serve a lot of you know, from my point of view, maybe you know, somebody might have a different opinion, but doesn't serve any purpose, and it's covered up by the hair. Nobody's going to look at the beautiful curve you put in there, you know. So
Like that?
this mortise, yes, there you go. This mortise here is cut too flat. You know, this creates a lot of weakness on the facets here, and this is something I was going to talk about. You know, since Chris brought up the curved cutting, you know, of a mortise on the head. You know, this is another issue I see. You know, the mortises that are cut, you know, with the flat sides. It is important to keep a little bit of an angle here. You know, create this, you know, angle in a little bit. Doesn't have to be much, but you really have to be careful not to compromise the faces of the head, the cheeks here. And the other thing that I've seen, and I think most modern bow makers and people that have trained with a master know that, you know, you don't want to cut your mortise on the head, you know, straight down. You want to angle your chisel in, so you don't, what we call in Brazil, open a window here on the side of on the side of your bow. And I've seen that happen with a lot of the makers in Brazil in the past. And I have worked with them, so you guys really have to be cutting in, you know, look at the angle of the head, copy that angle, or exaggerate a little bit more, you know, for your chisel when you cut your head there. So any other comments on?
Yeah, can I ask something? What do you think of T-mortise? Because I like I like them because I think they leave a lot of wood at the edges, and someone just told me last week, oh, but some other makers, they might you know, recut it to a trapeze. So I mean, I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, this one.
Yes, I think they are very interesting. And I see a lot of those on Baroque bows, you know. And
it's historical, on historical bows, yeah.
Eitan
do you think
early bows. Eitan makes historical bows.
Okay. Well, and I think that is the challenge is for people that don't normally see bows like that come through their benches. You know, if you don't do too many of these bows, or if you haven't done them, then it can create a problem. And I think that's the reason why some people say, well, I think the guy didn't have time to finish his mortise, you know, and then just recut it.
Because actually I find the plug for this is much more simple because the plug is rectangular. Yes. And even I use often hardwood, like boxwood, and you can reuse the plug. You don't need to make a new plug each time, which is really nice when you get the things to rehair. And I think that is structurally, you leave lots of wood on the edges. So I think it's...
Yeah, I don't know. Has anybody seen modern bows made with the T-cut?
Yeah, I've seen it a couple times.
Okay.
Did you like rehairing it?
No.
Tony, did you like rehairing it?
No, because I saw that early in my career, and I was like, "What's going on?" I was unfamiliar with it at the time, so I really had no opinion.
Yeah, when you see like the whole thing about the curved, you know, like Chris was saying, you see a lot of people think or try to emulate what Tort did, but Tort didn't do an entire curved side, you know, surface. He actually was pretty straight, and at the very end, he created a little like a notch-like. So that really gave a little bit more spread to create a wider ribbon on the head. You know, I don't do that, and I think that's a nice idea and so on. It does create a challenge also to make a nice plug. You know, you have to be super precise so the hair doesn't come around, you know, the sides when you do something, a rehair of a Tort, for example. But and I know a lot of modern makers do it. You know, they create a little notch on the very edge. Yeah, let's see. Little notch right at the very end here, and this end, but it's pretty much a flat, straight surface down. Any other questions on the head mortises?
I just wanted to mention the back of the head mortise being thick enough, because I've seen
That's a great point.
plenty of thin back of the head mortises.
Yes, and I think this one is too thin. This one is decent, is not too bad. But I like to leave about 4.5 millimeters. Again, I don't measure it. So if I measure this one here, that's 4.5 millimeters actually. So 4.5 millimeters minimum, for the.
Yeah, don't do what the Fretchner workshop did and leave like 2 to 2.5. I've done so many restorations on Fretchners that have blown out the back of the head. And then again, with a lot of respect to Vito and his company, the Brazilian bows are a lot better now than they were 15, 20 years ago, where that mortise was all the way back in the head, blowing out the back of the head there. So,
and I keep warranting these bows, like sometimes 10 years ago, somebody says, well, would you warranty this? It's like, I cannot in good conscience not warranty that, because I don't agree with the way that was made. So he puts me on the spot, and I said, okay, here's another bow properly made,
That's why we have respect for your company.
Yes.
So thank you.
I appreciate it.
What are your thoughts?
I try to be fair, and most people give like a year warranty, and I do that same thing with my own made bows, but with the company bows, and when I see something that luckily lasted 10 years, and I said, wow, that thing lasted 10 years without breaking, So I said, I cannot not give you, another bow. I just warranty things like that. So,
In regard to head mortises, what about depth of mortise?
okay, yeah, the depth of the mortise is also important. You need to leave enough room for that hair, the tie to be flat on the bottom, and also to have about, maybe a 4 millimeter plug thick, and we can get into the geometry of the plug and geometry of the mortise itself, but I think that's another class, another topic for people that actually are doing rehairs. And I think that would be an interesting thing to do in the future too, but you don't want it to have so thin that that plug actually is not doing a proper job holding everything in place. There's not enough strength and structure and contact surface on the back of the plug to the back of the mortise. So all those things you have to consider. I think a 4 millimeter thick plug is important, but sometimes I have to cut like a 2 millimeter plug. There's not enough room, So that's a great point. So if you make your bow, think about having enough room there for the tie plus about a 4 millimeter thick plug. That'll be interesting. Yeah.
I have a
Can you
question.
also talk about the edges of the top of the mortise, how thin it gets next to like where the plates often break?
At the very end. Yeah, I mean, I think for that, you don't want to get so close. Again, let me measure this one here. I think a millimeter is the max that you want to have there. And that is a very delicate part of the bow, and it's the most broken, parts that I see coming out of unskilled rehairs, people that cut a plug that is too thick. They say, well, it's soft wood, it will conform to the you should cut, you know, again, another discussion, but you should cut a plug that fits into that hole without any hair, without any pressure anywhere, but without leaving any room for the hair to come around. So I think 1 millimeter, you know, my opinion is the minimum you should leave there if you're working with bone or, you know, ivory. Florian, you had a
yes.
comment?
I do have a question about the depth of the mortise again.
Yes.
For violin and viola, I would normally make this depth about 8 millimeters.
Yeah.
But sometimes I want to adjust the weight a little, so I make it deeper. Is there? In your opinion, do you think the inner part of the head is part of the stability, or is just the width of the head the determining factor for this?
You know, my opinion is that I know a lot of people, when they do rehairs, they get the head and they measure the depth so they can cut, you know, like this one here. This one here is about 7.5. So they measure it so they can cut the width or the thickness of their plug to be flush. You know, the way I rehair is, to me, that's not important because, you know, even if the head mortise is 10 millimeters, and I'm normally rehairing both are about 8 millimeters, I always push my plug so until it's flush, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, and I know I've done the same thing on my bows. If I need to drop the weight on the tip a little bit, I make the mortise a little bit deeper. You know, I mean, in all honesty, you're basically taking out maybe 1/4 of a gram, if that much.
Yeah.
But it makes me feel better.
Yes.
All right, so I'll go to another aspect of the frog before I get to the stick. Is like when you make the throat on your frog, you know, all kinds of shapes and so on. But one thing you have to pay attention is basically the height near, you know, the underslide. If you're making this too thin, you know, basically you're getting this distance between the corner. You know, this is a weak point right here. So that distance there is important. If you're making this too thin, you're going to have very little ebony, you know, up there. And the way a lot of players play, and you know, and the other factor is like people use some cradles for the frog work that sometimes are not exactly cut in a good way for many different angles. They would put some pressure. You're going to crack the frog here. And so I've seen plenty of those. All right. So to mitigate that, you should be careful, you know, and I came up with about, I think, a 2 millimeter distance between the corner and the edge here at minimum. You know, you come up in an angle up because that's how it's going to try to spread. If you're putting a lot of pressure on this edge on the cradle, or as the bow rocks on the hands of a musician, you're going to create, you know, some tension here and to separate. And sometimes if it is too thin, it's too weak, it would end up creating a long crack here, same as it is with that previous one that I mentioned. Has anybody seen that happen or have
I think that's one of the most common early damages in modern bows, because as soon as there's play in the frog seating, it will want to push that wing over and break it off. So I think in my opinion, this is one of the most crucial aspects where makers can contribute to make it stable for a long time. A good fit is maybe one of the most important things.
Yes.
But even then, once the eyelet wears, it will create a little bit wobble, and then it will break. So I think for my bows, my best solution is to use a hill fitting, it might not be aesthetically for everyone, but I think it's one of the safest way to create a bow that plays for 100 years without any issues on this specific spot.
Yes, yes. And the heel fitting is great when you're talking about when you have musicians, in the hands of musicians. I think that's a good analogy, because the frog is really well fit for that stick. When you're doing a rehair, a lot of people, I've noticed, they don't have heel fitting, cradles for their frogs. So they will put on a regular, cut angle frog, a cradle.
I doubt that European makers use cradles so much as Americans. I'm not sure about this, but I've not seen many colleagues here rehairing bows on a cradle or on some sort of a device. Most put it in a
on a jig, right?
No, not on a jig, just into a vise padded with cork or something. So,
there's a lot of cradles in America, believe me.
Yeah. Okay.
And I use both. I use and actually I've been using cradles since I started doing bow rehairs, and I have cradles to fit both types of frogs. But back to this issue, you can see this frog here has a couple cracks, and I believe this is the original shape of this could be like a Hoyer or it's a nice German bow, but I only have the frog. So, but you can see a couple cracks developing, on the tops there. So, just create a little bit more mass, up front. You don't want to be too sharp for the musician, so it's uncomfortable. But again, aesthetics, how practical it is, and in the end, a lot of people. I know there are aesthetics for competition and aesthetics for, getting your bow out there in the hands of a musician and not hurting them. Basically, they really being comfortable with them, and primarily that's what I like to do. Find a balance of aesthetics for good looks, but that will feel really comfortable for the musician at the same time.
I just wanted to quickly note something that at least at Jerry's shop we were taught about why that cracks there, and I'm guessing the fit and all of those things have something to do with it, but sometimes it can be inevitable if the medullary ray is coming off of that point too. And then, so you have a point, and then you have the med, and then, the distance is important, but also the wood is shrinking around that metal and expanding, moving where the metal isn't moving as much. So that's always, a weak point.
Did Jerry have a suggestion on in your own making of orienting for the medullary rays? I mean, we talk about slab and cut, like that, but did Jerry have a suggestion?
I don't think he really had a hard suggestion on that. I mean, you see him in all different, he was just like, just notice, what you see on older bows, and you do see meds that are straight up and down, you see them on angles or even the opposite way. So, I do think that, that's a good question with like, if you did do them straight up and down, maybe there'd be more strength there on that corner, but a lot of people don't like the way meds look right on that surface, on the surface of their frogs, like on the side. So, I think it's kind of personal taste, but I do think that when you think about the medullary rays, you should think about the weaknesses that come with that, where they're placed.
Yeah, this is how I learned to, get basically blanks out of ebony, in that configuration. You get a lot more strength this way than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With the meds or the grain lines?
Well, the grain lines, the center of the log, and then
Can you bring that?
Medullary rays are going vertical, and then the
Bring it closer to the. There we go.
Oh, okay.
So you have the center. This is a small log or something like that. So you want the, all right.
So you'd be able to see the medullary rays on the rails.
Right, exactly, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Does anyone ever have the problem with where you're talking about it breaking here with that maybe being part of on the stick where the thumb is like worn out a groove, and so there's not maybe even material there for it to like sit against, I guess? I've seen that a lot with older bows that have big thumb grooves.
I see a lot of old bows, but I see a lot of things like this where, either the player said this is not comfortable, he goes home with a nail file or something and carves his own groove.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what you see. If you don't make it comfortable enough for the player, and if you're selling directly to a player, you should be 100% that he has comfort, when he's playing for a couple of 2-3 hours. And if he needs to make adjustments, you should be the one doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to avoid something like that.
To answer your question, Tyler, I do see a lot of bows coming in with heavy wear like that. And when there's a gap up there, that's actually one of the things I'll recommend is to fill it. There are different methods to fill it, but I do recommend filling it because it's like your toes on your feet give you that balance forward. But the other thing that I see that heavily impacts the breakage of the front of the frog is a worn eyelet where it allows the frog to pull
forward.
Okay, and one of the things, I don't know if you're going to address it, Vito, or not, but one of the things that's really frustrating for me that I see with a lot of modern makers is they will make the channel, the mortise in the stick, 3.5 millimeters, and so there's only like 1/4 of a millimeter of brass on the sides of the eyelet.
Oh yeah.
Just wear out eyelets too fast.
Yes.
And so things like that where the eyelet wears more rapidly than it would causes the frog to lift, and it causes those cracks. So I think that's all under the general heading of the accuracy of fitting the frog and how things wear with the screw holes and the eyelet. But,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think for, all things being optimal, if you have your bows in the hands of, constantly in the hands of a good, conscientious technician, he will look at you and say, well, you need a new eyelet every year or so, if that's the case. But that's not the case with a lot of people. That eyelet is going to end up breaking in many cases. And before it breaks, it will create that, that angle where all of the pressure is at the front of the underslide. And not only that, but if you have that frog is going to be rocking back and forth. There's not a good fit. You don't see, talking about in a dramatic way, yes, you have something that is way tipped over. But the slight tipping, angle there, it creates a rocking motion, and it will definitely be a problem. So I think it's something for new makers to consider, to leave enough room for the eyelet to be a long-lasting eyelet. Talking about long-lasting bows. Not only that, but use good quality screws that do not wear the eyelet, and lubricate your screws. I use beeswax. I know people use soap. Some other people use graphite. There's all kinds of ways that you can lubricate. But as long as you keep that lubricated, and this is something I do for every single bow that comes in, I lubricate it every single time, clean it, lubricate it. So.
I had a question too. So if we're talking about the fit of the frog, I know a few makers who will. It has to be a good fit, of course, but they leave that top facet or the bottom facet, however you look at it, they leave that a little bit with a small gap so that it takes into consideration the shrinking of the stick, so that after time you'll end up with a better fitting fitting frog. Is there any sense behind that really, or in construction are you just trying to make it as close to fit on all three facets as you can?
Yeah, the explanation I've heard, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is if you look at it, the frog fitting to the stick in a conventional way with three facets, what you want to picture is like a train on rails. So you have two rails, that prevent that frog from going back and forth. That, if you have the reverse, for example, you said leave a little gap, if you're gonna leave a gap, it's not necessary, but if it's going to be a gap, you leave the tiniest gap on the top facet, or the bottom one, like you said. So if I can get a stick here so I can show you. Here's an example of that head with a too thin of a mortise on the back. Anyways, so this right here, if you're gonna leave a gap, you're gonna leave a gap here. These are called the rails on like on a train, so that frog has to actually be really well fit here. Angle, complete contact all the way through. That's to me the most important part on the bow. When you're fitting the frog in there, you want to make sure that those are in complete contact. Anybody else has a different take on that? Well, the other reason is also, if you don't, if you have a gap on any of these, you create instability. Let's say you leave this touching and that touching, this will create instability. That frog is going to rock that way. So if you have both sides, you can just imagine it will just rock both ways. So this is basically, the sides of the frog are like the wheels on the train, and they need to be actually in full contact on those two rails. So,
can I ask something? Do you mean the rails in a hill fitting or a regular rectangular fitting?
Regular. I just called.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I get it.
Rails, yeah.
Because I thought that if actually there is a gap on the middle facet,
yes,
and the pressure is on the sides, it wants to do that to break the thumb projection in the middle.
Oh, it will put too much pressure sideways here. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but on the thumb projection in the
Yes, I mean, I tried not to leave any gap.
Yeah.
But with the shrinkage and so on, and wear, if you leave a tiny gap in a couple of years, you probably will have like the frog sitting really flush everywhere. And I'm talking a fraction of a millimeter gap. You don't want to see it with the naked eye. You really want to get like a 10 magnifier and see, okay, I see a small gap in there.
Just to get it out there, I've seen bows from very respected makers with huge gaps on the top facet. Like we're talking 0.5 millimeter at least.
Yes.
But they work very nicely on the
thing. I do know that some makers think if the fit of the frog is too harsh, too close to the stick, that it will inhibit the vibrating of the end of the stick. So some makers think that there might be a preference for older bows because there's a wear and the frog comes a little bit looser of the stick, so it might help, and they try to incorporate this feature into the modern bows.
Yes.
I don't have an opinion on this, but I think if a modern frog is so tight on a stick, it will create a problem in itself, because obviously the tightness means there is a pressure on wood parts that maybe might be a little bit too much for.
Yeah, I'll show you. I have this is my last bow. This is something, you know, that I learned from Robert Cower in Los Angeles. He said, Vito, I want my bows, you know, when the you know, the frog tightness to the stick and the mechanics. So when you do this, it has to go all the way forward.
We can't see it.
One finger only, you know. I mean, you're not tightening, but you want to get this all the way forward with just one finger until it touches there. I mean, so that, to him, that is important. And then from here, you use two hands.
Yeah.
So
I do have a question.
yes.
Is there any way, have you ever seen a bow that protects the stick from somewhere? Apart from putting silver wire under the thumb leather, but I mean, even the finest bow might end up in a player's hand where the nail is too long and it will dig into the stick. Have you ever seen an idea to protect this part of the stick?
I personally haven't, Florian. You know, I don't know if there are makers that have tried to, you know, insulate that, or, you know, I mean, that is a challenge. You know, here's I think the whole purpose of this conversation is to identify problems and try to come up with solutions. So there is one problem that I haven't really tried to put my head to it. It's like, well, how can we, you know, protect that? You know, just thinking out of the top of my head, you know, you could, and when you make a bow, put a little piece of carbon fiber, you know, just on that area, you know, and just inlay a little piece of carbon fiber shaped in the same way. And so that may help, but, you know, you're removing some wood. But in the end, you know, you're going to end up removing wood, like you said, with the wear and nail, and eventually that bow is going to need, you know, every single bow that I know of is going to need some kind of a graft or fill. Yeah.
Well, one thing, you know, we used to use, I do still use an optical epoxy occasionally for the fill of a repair of that. And that might be a possibility of like having an outer coating, because it is a harder material, but I haven't done that in making a bow yet. That would be interesting.
So yeah, if anybody comes up with an idea, you know, let us
There's
know.
that, you know, the film that people use on instruments a lot for someone with heavy sweat that deteriorates varnish quickly. That could be something. It's just like a self-adhesive, very thin plastic or something, maybe, and maybe just something like that that's
Well, the only challenge to that
easily removable.
Yeah, it has to be flush, and it has to be flush with, you know, so the frog can travel up and down on it, you know.
Right.
I mean, one wear is the one on top here of the frog of the frog area, and that you can mitigate with, you know, just putting a little piece of leather, or, you know, or a film, you know. I see a lot of you know, a lot of players that have very acidic hands, and they really eat through. So I put like a thick varnish for some of my clients on their cheaper bows. They don't want to put leather in there. So, but I think to make the bow last longer, you know, to that idea of maybe reinforcing the thumb wear, which will happen inevitably with every bow, will be an interesting point. Yeah.
I tried on one of my recent bows to put a coat of wood hardener. That some people are using this in furniture, just on the part of the stick that the player is using. So I'll let you know. And like I sold it to a guy who was destroying every bow very quickly. So I'll let you know in 5 years if it's working.
Yes, I got this thing here. I'll show you guys. This thing was shown to me by Bill Weaver, and he said, Vito, you should use this thing. It's a hoof. It's like it's for horses to protect the horse's hoof. So sorry for my pronunciations, but it's healthy hoof.
So, John, the product you would use, is that something that's used on window ledges or to restore rotten wood, or what is the?
It's used in furniture. Yeah, some people are using it for rotten wood, so it goes into the surface of the wood and makes it harder and fills up the pores a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So it looks more shiny afterwards, but I will have to see how it goes with surviving.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that's called?
I'll find it here. Wait a moment.
Just on the side, I will say there's a lupo that comes into the shop on a frequent basis where I've seen them use fingernail polish in places to also strengthen areas of wear.
Yeah. This is basically fingernail polish, but for horses.
Well, so the one I have is well, it's a French one. So, but it's called fondue, and well, I think it's called wood hardener in English.
Okay.
It's used in furniture making.
Well, I think we're coming close to the end. Is it, Tony? Not too far?
Yeah, just like a couple more minutes.
Okay. Well, let me. Go, anybody has a?
I was just going to say, Vito, can I introduce one area of frog making that I have repeatedly had to do restoration work on?
Absolutely.
I'll try to be quick because I know we are coming to an end. So one of the things I do most commonly in restoration is replace pearl from people that sweat it out. So a lot of makers will put a really thin pearl slide on there and just, having it in the hand, it gets sweated out. And so as a suggestion, a slightly thinner ebony backing and a thicker pearl will last longer in the hands of your sweaty players. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out. The other thing is in relation to, the geometry of making, as far as the angles here, I do like, in my own frogs, I do like to make a slightly deeper pearl slide channel to give thickness to the pearl slide and the backing. But I see a lot of makers doing exaggerated angles on the rails. And so I see if they're too exaggerated or not deep enough, you get wing cracks on the sides.
Yes.
And so, the things that I see repeatedly across my restoration bench inform me as a maker of what I could do slightly differently so that my frogs won't get cooked. And again, if we were talking at the beginning about you were leaving, space up here for people that put too much hair in there and then have to file out under here.
Yes.
If your rails are too thin or not deep enough and somebody jams your slide in there, it will crack out.
Yes.
And so those kind of things, I just thought I'd throw into the conversation as repeated problems that I see that inform my own making.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There's those rails are important. Their integrity is important because I've not that long ago I saw Matt Welling posting something that he a brand new frog, gold mounted. it was fitting the pearl, and the rail just gave up. So it can happen as you're making, but most likely there was a weakness on the ebony. But yeah, I think the angle is important, and yeah, because you're definitely going to meet, you're both going to meet some less skilled hands in the future that,
And just before we leave the topic of pearl, a thicker pearl,
yes,
lasts longer. Same thing, especially here on the audience side. There's a tendency I see in a lot of modern making. I think those little Ormeo shells that are about this big, you can get stunningly beautiful pearls out of.
Super thin.
They're like a third of a millimeter thick or something. They're very thin. And so they sweat out really quickly. So
yes.
As a maker, I like to think about what will still be there, and what are things not going to have to be replaced repeatedly. And so slightly deeper pearl eyes or thicker pearl eyes and a slightly thicker channel and pearl, they last longer.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
well,
thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. I want, probably there are a few things about the stick, the shape of the head, the front, the sharpness of the front of the ridge of the head, that compromise strength. Just to make a point about that, if you look at the first period of Sartori bows, super delicate heads, later on in life, he wised up, made, a little beefier heads. Look at swan head bows from, Dominic Picat. You don't see too many of them. It's beautiful to look at, but, there's like 90% of those things are splined. You very rarely see a beautiful swan head with a rounded back, on a 150-year-old bow. Anyways, I'd like to thank everybody. There's probably a lot more to this thing, as it's very organic. People start thinking about things like that, and I appreciate if people can keep me in mind for the future. If you come up with something, send me a quick. I would invite everyone to send me an email. Look me up. I'm easy to find. I thought about this, about how we can make bows last longer. And in any case, just keep your mindset on that, on that premise that you're making a bow for the ages, not for a couple of years.